All right, so as I was saying, my problems with Professor Thompson's whole notion was that without these systems of thinking, deontological, pragmatic, virtue ethical, and relativistic, you can't be moral. You can't be a confident moral reasoner. And yet it's interesting to note also that he had studied for some considerable time, what's his name? It was Schindler, Oskar Schindler. And Oskar Schindler had saved a number of Jews from concentration camps. And yet, in his view, and Thompson was a pragmatist, so it's really ironic that he seemed to believe this. Oskar Schindler was a terrible moral reasoner, and yet the end result, which is supposedly inadvertent, of his actions were that he ended up saving a number of Jewish lives. And it's really ironic for a pragmatist to say that that end result wasn't a good thing. I suppose you might say though, that a pragmatist isn't really that interested in the ends because those ends are only as great as the extent to which one can imagine sensible ends. And this is the problem with a conventional pragmatist, with a lot of pragmatism, frankly with Nazism and fascism, which is regarded as an extreme form of pragmatism and utilitarianism and net benefits, that usually people are very skeptical about what is possible because they're projecting from the past. This was the Wattsian argument. So, a competent moral reasoner would be very pragmatic and therefore very realistic about his expectations. But in Oskar Schindler's case, he didn't intend necessarily, according to Thompson, which I think is ridiculous, to save all those Jewish lives. It just happened inadvertently. That was not his end, for which he crafted the means like a good pragmatist would. No, he had totally different means that produced that end. And because Thompson identified as a pragmatist, apparently those ends were not justified by their means, because you can't do that. It's ironic to note that the first time I heard the argument that the means justify the ends was by a Holocaust survivor, or as someone who'd worked with him. The Holocaust survivor was Viktor Frankl, the logotherapist. And it's interesting to note, therefore, that a pragmatist like Thompson, for whom the ends seem to be the central focus, would say that that was not a good moral reasoning. So apparently we have to throw moral reasoning out the window now unless we want to be Nazis, for whom the proper end would have been the annihilation of those Jews. This is kind of when you have to note the postmodern is creeping up on you. I think a lot of people, come the time of the Holocaust, realized, yeah, rationalism and systematic thinking maybe aren't the best things for human life. And this is around the time that you ask your professor who said that Nietzsche was a Nazi, are you sure about that? Are you sure that you're not a Nazi? But I shouldn't be too sarcastic. The point is that morality has to lie somewhere outside of systems in many instances. Now, this isn't to say, this is another thing. Apparently in debate, at least high school debate, they have this law they call Godwin's Law, which says that the first person to call the opponent a Nazi loses. I might qualify that by saying that the first person to call the opponent a fascist loses, and considering that that's another way of stating it, I might also say that if you focus on the difference rather than the similarity, the way I get out of Godwin's Law is just by calling my opponents fascist, which is more general anyway, because how do I know that they're German, right? Or National Socialist? There are nuances there. But the thing about it is, taking pragmatism to an extreme isn't what you want to do either. You don't want to say, when I say that it's possible to say we shouldn't be moral, it's not the same thing as saying that you can be moral but still be wrong. Because that's just kind of a Nazi attitude too, if you think about it. This is the attitude that says we have to throw morals out the window because it becomes futile at that point. If you can still be wrong, even though you meant well, That means that you're of equal merit, that it's a gamble, you're of equal merit to the people who mean poorly, and the ends justify the means. So what is wrongness to be determined by? By forces outside of your control. Usually other people who are in power or privileged in some way, by some prejudice. And I think that after a while, this seems like a hegemonic attempt to make a moral reasoner snap and break down, and basically say, fine, I renounce morality, because if there's no way of saying that I was a victim in these circumstances, but I was actually the one who was at fault, if I'm to be punished for my goodwill, and if the people punishing me insist that the most moral thing of me to do is to surrender my goodwill and to become a pragmatist, that my goodwill itself did not justify the ends, then I might as well yield to that authority and surrender my individuality and join whatever the paradigm is right now, and might makes right. That's a Nazi attitude. So we don't want that. So there's a distinction between the contradiction of saying that you can still be wrong even if you did everything right, and saying that sometimes the right thing to do is to be wrong, or saying that you should not be moral. You might say that one condition against which you should abandon conventional morality and systematic morality is the situation where a hegemonic entity tells you that you're wrong even though you did everything right. Because that's schizophrenic thinking, right? That's doublethink. That's Orwellian. Because if you're doing something right, that's a mode of living. That's a means. Everything throughout your life is a means. How you treat people is a means. But if you privilege the other people and how other people are affected, that becomes the ends. Now these two things coexist. If you prioritize the ends over the means, though, you're prioritizing the group over the individual arbitrarily. But that means that the individual has nothing left to determine whether or not one is ethical. It also means that so long as you feel in your abstract view of how people might perceive you, or what outcomes might happen, and again, through a narrow pragmatic view, because as in Thompson's case, apparently there's no way that Schindler actually had the end goal of saving all these people. That just reflects, Thompson's own, short-sighted pragmatism. You might look someone in the face, and totally watch that person in pain, but do nothing about it because you're not interested in handling the situation. You're only interested in the ends. For you, life's become a series of ends rather than a series of means, which basically means that you're never living in the present, you're never attentive to what you're actually doing, and you're always dependent upon other people, even though, irrespective of the fact that they have moral choices too. They're capable of error, so to speak. And so, you can't just burden them with that responsibility as though they didn't have to figure this stuff out for themselves. So, in relation to that kind of an authoritative figure, or someone trying to portray that role, one might surrender morality, and that would be a descent into nihilism. The individual just goes along with whatever the paradigm says, and becomes, again, that kind of a totalitarian pragmatist, that kind of a fascist, that kind of a Nazi who can watch people suffer knowing it's for the greater good. This is what Nietzsche was actually operating against. That's not a good circumstance for surrendering morality. But there are good ones outside of that. So it's not as though what I'm saying, that you should sometimes not be moral, is the same thing as saying that you can be moral and still be wrong. Especially since wrong is just because who's going to say that? Especially since wrong is itself a moral a moral thing, I can't take that and integrate that into my moral system if it also means being perpetually at risk of being wrong. Um, the and the means have to sometimes justify the ends. It would have been better for the German Jews to starve alongside the German Catholics than for the Jews to be oppressed for the Catholics' sake, because in that kind of a power structure, look at how atrocious the suffering of the Jews becomes, and how morally corrupting to the German people, and how still corrupting to the German people, against whom a number of people have prejudices. How still corrupting to the European people, especially in Greece, who are creating their own forms of cruelty. It's not a good way of thinking. So I think this is how we got into the postmodern predicament, really, in part through the Holocaust and that atrocity, recognizing, things are nuanced. It's not either that the ends always justify the means, and I might say it's not either that the means always justify the ends. That's not exactly what I'm saying, but I'm saying that if you're a stringent means-oriented person, I do think that the means do justify the ends. You can't be wrong even if you did everything right, because life is what you do, not how other people perceive it and how you perceive them perceiving it. Because that's them just doing something that's their own responsibility and karma. And I mean karma in the traditional sense of doing, action, not in a mystical sense in this case. So, but it is possible, as I've stated time and time again, I'm not trying to bamboozle you or hypnotize you with circularity or anything of that nature, which is a ridiculous superstition that someone would do that. But as I've stated, as I keep coming back to, as I'm about to explain, sometimes the right thing to do is not to be moral. Or, sorry, sometimes you should not be moral. In the conventional sense, in the systematic sense. Even the deontological sense. But that's not saying that the means don't usually justify the ends. It's just saying that sometimes you can transcend that system. And you have to. In order to enter into this religious dimension that Kierkegaard talks about. Or to put it in Nietzschean terms, the impetus to be moral, underlying which we have that word should, which, as I've stated, is not just an affirmation of a moral code, but also a reaction to it. Can sometimes destroy the moral code itself. But that's what happens when the will to power is channeled in that way, and you get the ball rolling. The passion, to go back to Kierkegaard, burns to its own destruction. So imagine all these systems I was talking about that Thompson placed so much faith in, and a number of moral reasoners, such as deontology and pragmatism, and relativism, and virtue ethics. So very interesting ideas, right? Well, imagine a situation now, and I'm not going to use it, as I said, I'm not going to use any anecdotal personal examples just because they're too personal. As I was saying, the reason why this usually doesn't make its way as an argument into academic circles is because academia is usually a place where people try to keep their personal stuff personal and private. But given, if you have enough imagination, or at least enough life experience, or if you have enough life experience, or at least enough imagination, just to picture this for a moment, either drawing on just raw imagination or experience, or a combination of the two. Have you ever been in a situation so complicated that acting properly would be a violation of one system, acting properly in accord with one system would be a violation of the other? You might say, in this case, well, just pick a system, but that system's to pick a system seems arbitrary. Obviously, in order to pick one system over the other, you have to subsume the one system to the other. I'm sure you can picture something like that. Now, usually to handle a situation, you have to handle it in multiple steps. There are multiple things that you have to do, moment to moment, to make something work. to manage a conflict. And maybe not only is it that, in order to be pragmatic, you have to violate some principle of deontology, but also, at another step in the development, in order to be deontological, you have to violate a principle of pragmatism. Now, I'm just trying to paint this picture for you. Usually we pick one or the other, right? But what happens when you have to have both? What happens when the imperative of any system implies all the others? And you can't escape violating one of the systems. In other words, imagine a situation, if you will, where you have to actually resolve a conflict using both deontology and pragmatism, and maybe involving even a bit of relativism, because as Kohlberg pointed out, that's still a higher degree of moral development than, say, like authoritative thinking or conventional thinking or role fulfillment. And it's an important step towards arriving at what he called universals, which is a deontological thing, actually. I guess you could universalize pragmatism. That begins to sound like Nazism again, like absolutism. Because pragmatism is based epistemologically not in ideals and ideas, but in supposedly actual life, even though a lot of it is actually projected, depending epistemologically on how you look at it, like Alan Watts would argue. That kind of idealism is very related to the notion of a universal. That's more like deontology, right? Well, if you really think about it, you can imagine a situation where it's morally imperative that you operate within multiple systems, where any system that you choose implies using all the others, where in order to carry out your duty, you have to be practical, or in order to attain your goals, you have to honor your duty, and all of this might involve recognizing the relativity of a certain circumstance, and you have to note your own virtues and those of other people, and lend authority to people who've managed to actually act out of these systems. You can imagine a situation like that involves deontology and pragmatism and relativism and virtue ethics and maybe other theories as well, and theories not yet developed, in an integrated way. And in order to handle that situation according to any one of these systems, you have to involve all of the systems. You can imagine this in any kind of conflict management. In order to make one person happy, you have to make all the people happy, because everyone wants the same thing. And only if all the people, and it seems almost like a catch-22, how are you going to make all the people happy if you can't make one person happy to begin with? Well, it all has to happen at once. You see, that's the profundity of the cycle, all of the team members have to come together and create this product that's going to make all of them happy individually. You can't just privilege any one of them. And in the same way, you can imagine a situation where the very impetus of any system that you choose implies all of them. But not only is that the case, but also they are all contradictory. In order to be a deontologist, you have to violate some principles of pragmatism. There's a sacrifice that goes into that. In order to be a pragmatist, you have to sometimes ignore some of the means. Sometimes you have to make a generalization which violates the pretensions of the relativist. Sometimes you have to relativize in a way that the most stringent deontologists just think you're full of it. And sometimes even the most virtuous person might still be wrong. You can imagine a situation so paradoxical. And in that case, if being moral means operating within any one of those systems in an absolute perfect way, then you should not be moral. The very impetus that compels you to be moral makes it impossible for you to be moral in the conventional way. And you can't get rid of that impetus, can you? You can't escape. That's where Thompson was actually right. There is a matter of escapability. You can't just say, well, there are no shoulds and everything should fall into nihilism there. Because that is still a choice. This is almost like Sartrean, isn't it? That is still a choice. It still falls into one of these paradigms. But imagine the situation where you can't choose one paradigm over another without violating the paradigm that you've chosen. It's almost like if you choose a lover, but you insult her by choosing her, right, or him. You have to use all of them, but you can't make them all work perfectly. You have to violate them all at the same time as you honor all of them. By the way, don't extend the metaphor I was using about lovers, because it's terrible to say violating a lover, right? But you know what I mean, right? Like I'm looking at you right now personally, the viewer. You know situations in life that are like that, and this isn't an absurdist view, but in a certain way, it's akin to what Camus was saying about how reason is limited in its capacities. Like, it would be great if you could just make that one system work perfectly at the expense of all the others and then claim it to be the right one. But if by choosing it over the others, you still violate it, then it becomes impossible. That doesn't work either. You might have the goal in mind, the end goal of making that system work perfectly, and you're using the means of excluding all these systems. But what you'll actually find in reality is that by excluding those means, by using those means, by excluding all these other voices, all these other perspectives, because you reject relativism, which is sometimes good, but sometimes bad, either rejection of it or the system itself, that in itself actually ends up violating the very system that you intended to uphold. You see? So it becomes impossible. Like you can't uphold the system perfectly by privileging it over the other systems, because that very privileging is a violation, and that renders it imperfect. So what I'm getting at is, yes, sometimes life in its immense complexity does put us in situations where we should not be moral, where the very moral impetus that we find transcends itself and transcends the systems that created it or channeled it or whatever. And rather than backing away from that into nihilism, which is not necessary, and again, that's still a moral choice. It's just also, ironically, an immoral choice, an amoral choice. It's a bad moral choice. Rather than backing away from that or into madness and saying, it almost makes you mad to think about it, saying, okay, there are no shoulds from this point on. I reject all moral reasoning. Rather than doing that, which would still be a consequence of moral reasoning, right? And rather than allowing might to make right and allowing power just to take over and losing the civilized condition of the human being, we should acknowledge that, yes, there are these paradoxical circumstances. And they're not the same as those circumstances where people tell you that you're wrong even though you mean well, because they're just pushing you into nihilism again as well. There's no reason for you to be nihilistic. There's no reason for you to reject the whole moral scheme and all attempts to make sense of life and to be decent with people, because first of all, it's rather natural for people to want to care about one another, and nature abhors a vacuum, and if you reject all moral schemes, there's no imperative for you to do that, right? It's cyclical. If you reject them, then there are no more imperatives, so there's no imperative for you to reject them. You know, in a turn of phrase, you might also say, if you reject them, then you know that there is no moral imperative. It's really interesting how language works too. Like, but that's my point. That if you reject all morals, then there is no imperative for you to reject all morals. And that's both a causal statement, saying the rejection of morals leads to the condition to its own lack of necessity. But that's also a statement of awareness, like you should know, if you do that there's really no reason for you to do that. By your doing that, also there is no reason for you to do that, right? So what we have to look at is, if we consider civilized human life or just generosity to be a necessity, then that at least lends meaning to the word should. But if morality is a false necessity, then sometimes we should not be moral. And the one, I realize, and I'll conclude with this, I think the one group of people that really understood this better than anyone else was the Taoists. Because they said inferior virtue knows that it's virtue, superior virtue does not know that it's virtue, and therefore it has virtue.